Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another MEI Special Series e-learning program. Today's program is about superior talent acquisition, the new recruiting paradigm, and this is part 3 of a 4-part series. Today's subtitle is Competency and Personal Quality Interviews. Let me say that again. This is live, so we make mistakes. Part 3 is Competency and Personal Qualities Interviewing. My name is Alan Dunn. I'm president of GDI Consulting and Training Company, and I have with me today Christopher Rios, associate consultant.
Thank you very much, Alan. Looking forward to this session.
Today's program is a program that we started and Chris conceptualized quite a number of months ago in a way to kind of pull together not only how to go about recruiting, but more specifically, even how to identify the characteristics, the important characteristics of the individuals, the humans that you are going to be interviewing. Before we get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Manufacturing Executive Institute. MEI is a training and publishing organization that's dedicated to bringing relevant knowledge to individuals who are interested in making dramatic, that is, large performance improvements in their manufacturing and distribution companies. MEI delivers this knowledge to these communities in 4 distinctly different ways. One is through live training programs at MEI's state-of-the-art training center in Corona, California. The second is through e-learning programs produced by Radio MEI, and I mean e-learning programs much like this one. The third is through publications, which you can find at the MEI bookstore and other resources on the MEI website, which you can find at www.mfgexecutive.com. The fourth way that MEI provides information to these communities is through the focused research projects that we do within manufacturing and distribution. Today's program is part of MEI's special series of free e-learning programs. These are free. We do them periodically. They're always live and they're always free. Last session we did, I was in Europe. I'm actually in the studio live with Christopher today, so this one should be hopefully a little smoother than normal. Topics in these special series range all over the place. Usually they're suggested either by people in our own firm or by clients or other people who are periodic listeners. So we would hope that you would set aside the 60 minutes to participate in these periodically. By way of introduction, I already indicated my name is Alan Dunn. I'm president of GDI Consulting and Training and also the founder of the Manufacturing Executive Institute. I'm also the responsible individual for the next generation leadership, supply chain leadership programs at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California. I've been in the manufacturing and distribution business for over 40 years. I sit on quite a number of boards of directors, or have sat on quite a number in my career. I currently sit on the boards of Idaho Asphalt, largest liquid asphalt supplier in North America, and also Natural Alternatives International, a public traded or NASDAQ traded contract manufacturer of dietary supplements, food products, and also vitamins. I've been involved with APEX, which is a wonderful professional association for those of you in the manufacturing and distribution industries. APEX is the preeminent supply chain professional association across the globe. I was the chairman of the board in 2015 and have been active at board level activities there for quite a number of years. That's about me. Let's talk a little bit about Christopher. So Christopher is an associate consultant at GDI. He's really our lead executive recruiter, and he's our resident behavioralist. So he really spends a lot of time in our talent acquisition practice, and he spends a huge amount of time in there thinking about how to separate average performers from extraordinary performers. He also now co-instructs at the Caltech leadership programs that we do. He has over 8 years of manufacturing and startup experience, probably done over 500 interviews, both from screening and behavioral and some technical interviews as well. So he spends a huge amount of time in the behavior and the human aspect side of talent acquisition. His background includes a master's in organizational and behavioral evaluation from that great West Coast School of Claremont Graduate University. So we're really happy to have Christopher here today. Just to wrap up the introductions, you might want to take a look at the website. GDI's talent acquisition practice was started a number of years ago, and it really was built off of the concern that many of our clients kept hiring the wrong kinds of individuals. As we said, they hired really nice people. They were just misfits. They were the wrong people oftentimes for the wrong position. And so we decided that with our vast experience in manufacturing and distribution companies and our breadth of experience from the boardroom to the storeroom, that we could help them. So we built this practice. It's been very successful. We do executive retained search, executive coaching, and career coaching, leadership and organization assessments. And we also license a lot of the methodologies that you'll see in this and subsequent programs to our clients, as well as do the actual talent acquisition. Now, today's topic is really urgent. We think it's not just important, but it's urgently important because better hiring decisions start by using a data-centric framework in the recruiting process. We're going to talk about structured interviews here because structured interviews are the start to bringing data into the process. In session 1, we really kind of addressed the overall framework. In session 2, we talked more about competencies and personal qualities, and now we're going to actually talk about how to interview to those characteristics. So without saying a whole lot more and without a lot more introduction, let's get right into this, part 3, competencies and personal qualities. Chris, why don't you tell them where we've been?
Sure. Thank you, Alan. So in part 1, as you kind of already discussed, the talent acquisition framework, we really introduced the overall recruiting framework, the fundamental 8-step talent acquisition process. We talked a little about why companies and some of our clients continually hire the wrong people and what to do about it. We really talked about some of those interviewer biases, that those are so critical to be aware of and how to address those. And we introduced the competencies and qualities framework. In part 2, how to create a winning job description and how to screen candidates, we really talked about how to transform a basic job description into a well-developed and thorough competency model, what we call a superior talent competency model. And in part 2, we provided a sample version of that with a VP of operations role. And what we're going to do today is kind of follow along with that and how do we interview for some of those critical competencies and leadership characteristics for a VP of operations type role. And we also discuss how to efficiently screen candidates into the talent acquisition process. So today, competency and personal qualities interviewing, we're going to remind everyone the importance of a structured and repeatable interview process, how to incorporate that new evidence-based recruiting paradigm into the process, how to target the right competencies and personal qualities, and more specifically, how to interview for those, what are some questions we can ask, and then ultimately how to use that data to gain insights into critical leadership indicators. So as a reminder of the fundamental 8-step talent acquisition process, it really starts with defining job requirements. That's step 1, and that's building that thorough and detailed competency model. It's really the basis of any recruiting process. If we don't do a good job there, we're really setting ourselves up for failure for the remainder of the process. We didn't talk much about sourcing candidates, but we want to start building that candidate pool. Step 3 is how to screen candidates into the talent acquisition process. How do we move from the 500 to thousands of resumes we may have and really start selecting the few individuals that we really want to interview. And today we're going to focus more on steps 4 and 5, how to evaluate, so how to interview for those competencies and qualities, and then how to use that data to build a complete candidate profile. So as we get started, we left off in session 2 really how to develop that really thorough competency model, and then how to start reviewing resumes and how to screen individuals into the talent acquisition process, or more specifically, the interview process. So kind of where we're at now is we have that yes pile of resumes and people we really want to spend some more time with. So before we really get started into the details of the interview process, let's review just a few interview basics. So what we want to do, and a lot of this comes from my own experience, since we spent the time developing that competency model, we want to review that every time we start a new interview. We want to be aware and remind ourselves what we're looking for with this specific position. We want to incorporate challenges that this position will face. So a lot of that's going to come with speaking to the hiring manager, or in our case, the clients. So what are some daily challenges that this person will face? And let's use that information to develop some questions around that. And when we're interviewing candidates, let's learn and see how they will address certain issues, challenges, and how they will go around those obstacles. It goes without saying we want to make sure to use the same model throughout, And really what we're doing in this interview process that we will be discussing today is we will be interviewing to confirm competencies and personal qualities that we're learning about these individuals from their resume, from their experience, from those early conversations. We want to ensure to use a structured and repeatable process, absolutely use the same interviewer for each interview step. So in some cases, I do a lot of the behavioral interviews. Alan does the technical interviews. We're going to use a phase gate process, which we will go over a little more later. And then also, we want to develop a scorecard. So we want to keep track of how interviewers and candidates are going through the process. And of course, like I said, we want to remind ourselves of those potential biases throughout the interview process.
Thank you, Chris. So Chris talked about a phase gate process, so I want to walk you through our phase gate process, and then Chris will take over and actually talk individually about the different steps. But here's what we do, and here's the process that our talent acquisition group has built over the years, and it really boils down to 8 steps. So the first step, after you receive the resume and decide who to interview, so there's obviously, as you remember from the prior graphic, there are actually steps before this. But when you really get down to interviewing, the first interview is what we call a lifestyle interview, which is really, is this person suited to do the job, and is the job suitable to the person? And Chris will elaborate on that a little bit more in a few minutes. Gate 2 is the job competency screening. As you remember from the prior sessions, the 75% of the reason people fail at their job is lack of job competency, or lack of, sometimes we call it technical competency. Either they had it and they lost it, or they never had it and they fooled prior employers. But lack of job competency is oftentimes the real reason why people fail at their jobs. The fourth gate is the communications interview, communication skills assessment to be more precise. This is where we actually assess their ability to communicate. Chris and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Gate 5 is the behavioral assessment, not to be confused with Gate 6, which is the organizational and behavioral interview. So an assessment means they actually have to do something that we can then assess. So it's not an interview. It's more of an evaluation or a testing process. So Gate 4, which was the communication skills assessment, you'll see in a minute, is actually requires them to do something and share it that we then effectively evaluate or grade. The Gate 5 behavioral assessment, Chris will talk to you about some psychometrically tested assessment instruments that we use. And then Gate 6 is where we actually do our own organizational and behavioral interview. Gate 7 is a social interview where we actually meet them in a social setting, and we try to understand how they operate, how they work, how they talk, how they behave, what their manners are, those sort of things, which you can only do in a social interview. Interestingly enough, Gate 7 in our process is the first time we physically meet them. But that's because all those prior gates where there's interviewing is all done through a video interviewing platform in order to save time, money, and expense. But Gate 7, there's nothing, this is all high touch. There's very little tech in this one. It's all high touch. And then Gate 8 is the client doing their interviews. Now remember, in our process, by the time the client meets the individual, they've gone through those first 7 gates, and they've successfully passed through those gates. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort, and the participants willingly spend a lot of time and effort because they see a new opportunity the same as we see a new opportunity, that both parties have to be satisfied. So candidates also get useful feedback at each step of the process. That's how you bring dignity to the process. So at the end of, say, Gate 3, job competency interview, there's information that's actually fed back to the candidate. Chris, why don't you tell them a little bit about the lifestyle screens, because you do so many of these.
Right. So the lifestyle screen is really just our name for that kind of initial phone screen where I started touching on in the last session. So with the lifestyle screen, we're really looking to understand the candidate's general capability to execute the job requirements. So part of this interview, for me at least, is spending some time going through that resume. I never like to do a whole interview that's just a resume history interview, but the resume does tell us a lot of information, provides a lot of valuable information on these candidates, and I will sit down with them kind of going position by position, asking a lot of questions. From there, I want to also just ask basic questions in terms of, can they execute the job requirements? Can they live where this position is located? Are they willing to relocate if they had to? Are they going to be able to fit in terms of salary requirements? Also, we're also looking to just understand better some basic technical skills and leadership styles in terms of what this position is looking for. And really, in all of the interviews that we conduct with candidates, we're always trying to understand if the candidate would be a good fit for the position and for the client, and vice versa, that this is a good position for the candidate as well.
So then we move on to our phase, we call it 2A, which is the job competency screening. To do this, we take the competency model, the superior talent competency model, which we've provided you a sample of one, and we go through there and we identify the questions that will really help us to understand the competencies. Now, we happen to have a library of thousands of questions. So those that are related to a VP of operations would be different than those related to a director of finance, which would be different than those suggesting maybe a director or VP of engineering. So we use that to actually identify the questions, and then again through a video conference, we ask those questions. Now, I would also suggest you could do these competency models in person. Everything doesn't have to be done by video if the person is close. But as you know, today, we look for talent in more than the neighborhood, especially at the manager, director, vice president, president, CEO levels. We look for talent wherever the talent is. So the screening assessment is that kind of preliminary, gets to the 10 or 20 questions that are important. 2B is the detail. So that oftentimes Chris will actually do the job competency screening assessment. I'll follow on operations and finance jobs, particularly for me because that's my background, on the job competency interview. And those are the detail questions. So in a sense, 2A is the litmus test questions that if they don't answer. So for example, if we're looking for a vice president of quality assurance, and one of the litmus test questions there might be characterize in layman's language what standard deviation means. If they can't do that, then they probably aren't qualified to be a person. Just like we asked a controller or a vice president to describe what's the formula that, and just give us the logic of what return on investment means, or what does return on capital employed means. If they can't answer that, then there's no reason to go to a 2B interview, in other words, a job competency interview. So the job competency interview is much more detailed than the assessment. Then we get into the communications assessment. There's a lot of ways to do this, and you can go on the internet, you can find 100 ways to do this, but we've boiled it down to two parts. Part one is that we really introduce the candidates to a brief case study and ask them to develop a kind of a 2-page report or a 2-page memo to the CEO. And then they submit that to us, and we evaluate that. And then part two is they then take that and turn that into a presentation. Because so much of managing and so much of leading is assessing problems, real live reality case studies, if you will, and then trying to explain that in writing to others, and then trying to explain that in a verbal way with even more individuals, and how do they structure that. If you can't properly analyze, if you can't properly explain in writing, and if you can't appropriately explain in a presentation, then probably you have some communication skills deficiencies. So this is, when we say assessment, it's an assessment because we actually ask them to do something, and then we come back and we ask them to participate in an interviewing process. Chris, why don't you talk about 4A and B, our behavioral assessment, and particularly about the Hogan assessment report that we use.
Sure, absolutely. So the behavioral assessment, or I should say actually the interview, really deals with a lot of those candidates' key behavioral characteristics and personal qualities, and we will be reviewing those shortly. So a lot of that deals with initiative, integrity, collegiality, team spirit. So we're really looking to dig deeper into those personal qualities. And like Alan said, with the competency interview, similarly here, we have a huge folder of questions that we can draw upon depending on the position and the type of leadership role that this person will be taking. And we really seek to dig deeper in those leadership and behavioral characteristics. And the reason this is more of a behavioral interview, because it does ask the candidate to draw upon a lot of past experience. And one thing that I always do here, this is a really great interview to really dig deeper and verify and clarify a lot of the experience that they have on their resume. When they say they led this project or this team, feel free to ask a lot of questions and spend a lot of time just in one question in one area to verify the information that you're looking for. And what we also do for certain positions, we like to partner with Hogan Assessment. This is a third-party external assessment that we like to use. And there's a ton of assessments out there. Really, recruiting nowadays, almost everyone that I speak to uses some type of assessment, whether it's Hogan, I've seen Insights, DISC. There's a lot of them out there. But the reason we kind of settled on Hogan at the moment, it's a great behavioral assessment, and it really seeks to understand how these individuals will operate in a business setting. So this is not a personality assessment. This is not it's not going to tell you their big five style. It's really going to tell you how they operate in a business setting. Really starting with the Hogan personality inventory, which describes how they will relate and work with others. But really the most interesting aspect of this is their Hogan development survey, where it really discussed potential derailers. So there's a lot of research on derailment science in business. And really what derailment science is all about is how people behave under times of strain, stress, frustration, anxiety. As we know in business, we're faced with issues every day, and we want to understand how these people will react in those types of settings, and kind of from there seek to also understand how do they manage that derailment and those behaviors.
So then after that, we move to the social interview. The social interview is the first physical meeting where we physically are standing side by side or sitting across a dinner table side by side with the candidate. All of those previous assessments and interviews were done online or using a video platform. I cannot encourage you enough to use video platforms for interviewing. It's not quite the same as being there, but it's really close in today's with today's technology. We rarely find an individual who can't adequately perform or to interview on a video call. So everybody has a laptop. Everybody's laptop has a camera. And we've had one individual who didn't have a camera, so we sent him a camera. We don't, the camera's $12 anymore. We don't really care. And so the point is that you can do so much interviewing via video platforms now, and then that way you can cover a wider base of candidates from a wider geography, and you can truly find that talent that really adds value to your organization. Then the social interview is the face-to-face meeting. At GDI, we're really trying to, at this point, kind of turn the tables, where our clients hire our talent acquisition group to find the best talent. It's at this point that now we become an advocate of both the talent as well as our client, because we want our talent, the talent we're interviewing, this candidate, to ask any and all questions about the company that we can legitimately fulfill or legitimately respond to. So we really want to make sure that the candidate is really comfortable with the situation that they're going into. And it's also an opportunity to evaluate a number of their personal characteristics. It's an opportunity to evaluate their manners and those and their kind of their socializing skills or social skills. So that becomes really important. And then after that, we build a report for those that have really passed. So if we go from 150 resumes down to 30 that make it through the technical, down to 10 who make it through, say, the behavioral, and maybe 5 who make it through all of that plus communications. So now let's imagine we're down to the bottom 3 or 4 because it's a phase gate process. So now we build a report, and Chris will talk a little bit about our superior talent acquisition report that we built. But what it really is it's taking all that and is presenting the data to the client. But so the data is now pretty much complete. We will have the social interview. We will complete it. We will give the client what we refer to as the STAR report, Superior Talent Acquisition Report, which is a detailed, thorough evaluation of every technical skill set, every behavioral skill set, all of their instruments, everything that we've done, and then the client will say, yes, I want to interview those 3, or I only want to interview 2 of them. And there's some meetings and discussions we have, but more importantly, when the client goes to interview, there's no reason for the client to ask them technical questions because we've already dealt with that. Our typical technical interview is 100 to 125 questions. So we can pretty much verify to the, and can state and provide an opinion to the client about the person's technical skill sets or their behavioral skill sets, even emotional intelligence, which Chris will talk about in a minute. So what we work with then is the client on what else can they interview, which is really about collegiality and collaborative characteristics, ability to work with their peers, their fit, that word fit, which we know it when we see it, but it's hard to describe, and then really to understand more about the candidate's personal values and belief systems that would be particularly useful to the candidate. So we don't just give the candidate a report on the employee, give the client a report on the candidate. We actually encourage them and share with them the best way for them to interview to get even more out. Because at the end of the day, there's a chemistry that has to happen between the candidate and the client, and the candidate and the hiring party. If that doesn't exist, then it should be a no-go. So Chris wants to talk a little bit about this kind of 360 view of candidates, so this kind of holistic view. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about why we do all of this?
Right. So you know, over the last few slides, we walked through that phase gate process from steps 1 through 7, 8, and all of the interviews that we conduct. And, you know, we've heard it a few times. It's a little crazy, but we have to remember that, you know, as candidates are moving toward the final interviews, not everyone's doing that. Oftentimes, many candidates don't make it past the technical interview. And so we sit down with them. We share with them in a clinical and objective manner why we're not moving them forward. We always provide feedback at every step of the process. So ultimately, at the end of the day, like Alan said, we have 3 or 4 individuals who have gone through everything. But the reason we do that, it does give us that holistic view of that individual. We spent the time reviewing their resume and their background. We had that initial phone screen and determined this is the individual we want to introduce to the recruiting process, the interview process, and move forward with them. We go through all of our GDI interviews and assessments. We use those third-party assessments to get a different perspective that we can't often get from the interview process. There's just some things we can't learn in an interview. So we always seek to use some type of third-party assessment. Then, when appropriate, we conduct those reference checks and background checks on the candidate to verify a lot of these personal qualities and, you know, follow with certain questions that we may have. And then ultimately, before the client even makes their decision, we like to sit down with them as well and talk to them. Well, why do you like candidate A? What don't you like about this person? If you hire this person, what kind of further development would this individual need? So we take that complete 360 view on that individual to make those better hiring decisions.
And that 360 includes a real detailed look and a presentation to our clients. And if you did this yourself, you would create that same sort of internal presentation. You would be able to really provide an opinion on this candidate's job competency. If you're hiring, let's say, a vice president of supply chain management, there's a lot of disciplines within supply chain management. So we would be able to say, here's our opinion of this individual's knowledge, not superficial knowledge, but deep knowledge of planning or of scheduling or of purchasing or of cost accounting, all the disciplines and more that are involved in supply chain management. We would then be able to provide an opinion on this person's critical thinking skills, because many of the questions that are asked in the job competency interviews are really around how to critically think through a problem. We actually encourage individuals to think out loud. We actually tell them in this interview, unlike a lot of interviews, it actually works in your benefit to think out loud, because that helps us to understand not just can you answer the question, but how do you get to the answer, which is so critical today, because, you know, in the manufacturing and distribution world today, where things are changing so rapidly, the rule book runs out for leaders almost every day. And so managers and leaders really have to have the highest of critical thinking skills. Then the communication skills through the assessments and the interviews that I talked about. And then we look for their personal initiative, how they've solved problems in the past. We evaluate their level of curiosity, how imaginative they are, creativity. Curiosity is, does this individual really wonder and ponder why things in the companies he or she has worked for work the way they work? And then imagination is, what were the alternative solutions they had for those problems that they might have expressed during the interview? And then creativity is, how did they actually engineer the new solution, whether it was a technical or behavioral solution? How did they actually go about, how creative were they in engineering that solution? Then we get back to some competencies about how do they go about making decisions, and where does their judgment come from, and how does that judgment manifest? After that, we've talked about these in the prior program, but after that, we then are able to, we have questions that really get at their ambition. Does ambition get in the way of common sense? Are they enthusiastic, or are they delusionally enthusiastic? What kind of ability do they have to work as a team and really promote the team, which is a little bit different than collegiality, which is that respect for other teams, not just teams, but for other individuals. And then what about their honesty and integrity and courage and tenacity, and how have they demonstrated tenacity by sticking with something beyond where the average person would stick with it? And then how much self-discipline do they have in their daily routines, and how much the discipline in business is really important. So for example, we see it all the time in systems implementations where people implement new information systems, but they don't manage the basic quality of the data going into their computers. And so, as they said, garbage in, garbage out. And a highly disciplined IT professional would not think that way. They would be concerned very much about the quality of the input data. So that tells us about their disciplines in terms of their ability to sacrifice today to make the long term better. And then how confident are they? And we try to get at that line between confidence and arrogance. And there is a line where one is overly confident and can't back away. So the yellow on here are those competencies. The blue are the personal qualities. And then by combining some of those elements, we're able to get it to 13 additional leadership indicators: emotional intelligence, inspiration and motivation abilities, work-life balance, people development, how they look at developing a people, how they manage conflict, how they personally manage derailment. So conflict with others is different than internal derailment. How fast a learner are they? Oh, isn't this an important one? Being able to learn fast in today's environment. Do they always have dogmatic responses? Or do they believe in dogma, or do they believe in innovation? And then how self-reliant are they? In other words, can they find ways around workarounds if necessary for the short term? And how engaged are they, and how passionate are they? Is the job a job, or is the job something that they really love accomplishment and get a lot of accomplishment out of? Their ability to collaborate, and then this thing called deliberate practice, which is the ability to self-identify their weaknesses and deliberately practice their ways out of those. We'll talk more about that later. And then the ability to change the organization around them. So each of these measures, it really comes from composites of several of the competencies and personal qualities to give us that, as Chris said, that 360-degree view. Now, what we value most in candidates, after looking at candidates for nearly 40 years, we really look at the first 7 of those characteristics really heavily, because we've discovered that these are the strongest predictors of future sustainable job success. The first one is the core of this sphere. It's job competency. Moving downward is critical thinking, followed by communication, followed by personal initiative. Now working upward, it's curiosity, imagination, and what we call ideation skills, part of imagination, and creativity. So competency, critical thinking, communication, personal initiative, curiosity, imagination, and creativity, as you remember from a slide in session 2, drives about 96 to 99% of the success, or those are the success factors for moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about how we evaluate technical competency. Technical competency is the capability to apply or to use a set of related knowledge, skills, and abilities to successfully perform critical work functions or tasks, activities, if you will, in a defined work setting. So we do this by building into the interviewing some straightforward and some logic questions. So every section of competency evaluation is about straightforward and logic questions. Logic questions help us in the critical thinking aspect of what seems straightforward. So for example, a straightforward question might be, what is value added and how can it be achieved in a manufacturing company? What are the components of cost of goods sold or cost of sales? What does EBITDA or EBITDA approximate? What costs normally get capitalized in inventory? So if we're interviewing for a operations manager or a plant manager or a manufacturing operations director, these might be straightforward questions that we would ask. Look, if you can't tell me what costs get capitalized inventory, then you haven't been paying attention in your prior jobs. Then logic questions, things like imagine your company has sold a large machine to a very important international customer. The machine is to be delivered in 8 months. The customer has given you a large advance deposit for your sales terms and conditions. How should the advance deposit be recorded in the general ledger? And by the way, and why? This might be a question you would ask a controller candidate. So obviously you wouldn't ask this question probably to that operations candidate, but we'd ask that to a controller candidate. Another one might be speculate for a moment. What would be the typical technical, organizational, and behavioral impediments? What would exist if you were trying to move from end of batch inspection to in-process inspection? So that would be to an operations manager or to a quality director or a VP. In other words, the logic questions, there's no perfect answer. But it's the answer and the logic of how they get to it that is so important to us. Now, that means that within inside of everything, there are critical thinking sort of approaches to ways to get critical thinking aspects out of the candidate. But there's more overt ways. So Chris, why don't you talk about how we evaluate critical thinking skills and how our listeners can try to do this on their own starting tomorrow?
Sure, absolutely. So like Alan said, we really seek to understand a lot of their critical thinking in these questions that we develop. But we also have specific questions for critical thinking that we use to evaluate as well. Or we could also use external tests like the Watson-Glaser 2 critical thinking evaluation instrument. We have those focus interview questions to really understand logic or I'm sorry, if the candidates understand logic and not the facts. Do they take questions to environments unfamiliar to the candidate? Seek to understand how they solve problems, how they address problems, what's the rationale behind it, what's the process they use to problem solve. So as you can see here, some further critical thinking specific questions that we have here are, imagine the president of a major Midwest capital equipment manufacturing company calls you and asks for your expert help. She tells you that inventory is rising rapidly, shortages of critical components are increasing, shipments to customers are becoming increasingly late, and some of her best customers are canceling orders at an increasing rate. You suggest to the president that you will start your diagnosis by touring her manufacturing facility. And we like to ask, where do you start your tour? And again, this is more of a logic question, so we really want to understand the thought process behind their answer. Alan, you want to go to the next slide? So really, so much of critical thinking is that problem-solving methodology, how they seek to identify a problem, as you see in this visual here. Do they define the context? What are the facts and circumstances that frame the problem? How many choices do they enumerate? What are our most plausible 3 or 4 options to address this issue? How do they go about analyzing the options, and how do they decide what is the best option? And then do they explicitly list reasons, kind of the pros and cons, why one option is better than the other? Further clear signs of a critical thinker, they always gather the essential and relevant information. They really value the facts and the details and the information. They use abstract ideas to interpret information. They're open-minded and always open to alternative conclusions or options to solve an issue. And ultimately, they really know how to communicate effectively with others in the quest to solve complex problems. And as you see here at the bottom, and most of all, a strong critical thinker is keenly aware of their own biases and prejudices. They work consciously to not be unduly influenced by these, and they weigh theirs and others' perspectives equally, and always work to keep all ideas, perspective, and fact in balance.
Yeah, and before we go to the next slide, I might want to add to that last point that Chris made, is that all critical thinkers that you've ever known have worried about how their biases have tainted their directions or tainting their direction that they want to go. And so when you interview and you ask somebody how they came to a conclusion, it's always good to ask them, do you have any biases that could have possibly helped you to get to that conclusion? If they don't look up at the ceiling, think for a second or two. If they say to you, no, I have no biases, then you might want to evaluate critical thinking a little bit more with them, because typically a good critical thinker will clearly articulate what their biases are and how they already addressed them before coming to that conclusion. Chris, so why don't you talk about emotional intelligence? This gets a lot of publicity, but this is not an over-intellectualized idea. Emotional intelligence, or EQ oftentimes as it's referred, is really important to understand on those that you are about ready to hire. So Chris, why don't you talk about EQ a little bit?
Sure. One of the things we failed to mention in your control panel there, we did provide some sample behavioral questions. So definitely download that file and take a look at those. So like Alan said, as for myself as a researcher and our clients, they're very, very interested in emotional intelligence. And one of the reasons is we know that, on the other hand, IQ is pretty fixed across the lifespan, whereas emotional intelligence is something you can really work on a daily basis to really improve your ability to understand your own drivers and motivators and how to work with others. So really, emotional intelligence is the capability to be aware of and in control one's emotions and how to effectively handle relationships in the workplace. So for our own work, we really look at 4 components of emotional intelligence. And the foundation, it always starts with that self-awareness. We look to learn about the individual's level of self-awareness. Do they understand what motivates them, what their triggers are, what their natural physiological reactions are? How do they manage that? Once they understand what those drivers and motivators are, how do they manage that and allow themselves to work with others? Social awareness is the ability to really tune into the cues around them, those behavioral cues around them, and really get a sense of how people work in the organization, what that organizational culture is. And then finally, relationship management, putting all of that together to really be able to work with others in the organization. So some questions we have here, and like I said, they're in the document that we provided. Have you ever experienced a time when you suddenly realized that your conduct was perhaps inappropriate for the situation you were in and needed to change your behavior? So that really gets out that level of self-awareness and self-management. Suppose you're about to experience a difficult or stressful situation, such as firing an employee or participating in a meeting where you anticipate strong disagreement. How would you prepare for such an event, right? And we have some other questions here. And the reason emotional intelligence is so important, so as you're going through these questions, what are you looking for? So you're looking for people who understand their own strengths and weaknesses, what their drivers are. They understand the importance of a work-life balance and how to work with others. Another thing that's really, really important is how individuals manage conflict in an organization. Effective conflict management is often exhibited by participative leaders. These individuals do not shy away from conflict, rather they confront it directly and are able to bring people together to come to logical conclusions. So conflict management, kind of what we're looking for here when we ask some of these questions you see on the right, it's really all about timing, how to deal with that conflict at the right moment. It's also about understanding boundaries and behavioral tendencies of the other people that these individuals will be working with. It's about respecting differences among people and even the hierarchy of the organization, how to confront that tension in a logical and unemotional manner. And then finally, we need to find common ground when dealing with conflict. So some questions I've provided here. Imagine that there's someone at your company that you must work with, but who is behaving in a difficult and unprofessional manner towards you. Should you confront this person directly or make your case to the person's supervisor? A lot of these questions, there's no right answer. We really want to understand how the candidates come to their conclusion and how they pick the best option. Another question you might use, what do you do when your priorities change quickly? Give me an example of when this has happened. Oftentimes, conflict management really deals with itself. It doesn't deal with other individuals.
Yeah, I might add to that, Chris. Christopher and I have had much discussion about conflict management, and we've made the observation that one of the fatal flaws of many managers is their inability to manage conflict, or more important, their inability to embrace this as part of their jobs. You know, when you look at the questions that Chris has suggested on the right, you'll notice that a lot of it boils down to how one addresses and effectively deals with changing priorities, how one manages the mutual respect equation, or actually embraces that, and how also one embraces the need for change and how to introduce change effectively. Clearly, one of the key elements, one of the most important things to evaluate when you're looking for a leader, not just a manager, but a leader of human beings, a person whose job it is to inspire and motivate, is you have to look for how they manage conflict. And do they see conflict as something to be avoided, or do they see conflict as something to be embraced that, if handled correctly, can actually improve the organization? Chris, you want to talk a little bit about change management?
Sure. So change management is one of those leadership indicators that we look like that really encompasses a lot of the competencies and personal qualities that we evaluate in the interview process. It really touches on some of those technical skills. Certainly it deals with critical thinking and communication skills. And in terms of personal qualities, we're looking for people who have that passion, that motivation, and the tenacity and grit to really move forward with a comprehensive change in an organization. So some questions we might use here, we might use some direct questions like describe an experience from your past that illustrates your capability as an effective change agent. So we want to learn a little more about their past experience in terms of organizing change, sustaining it within an organization. Describe a time when you had to ignite a change effort in your organization. What situation did you face, and how did you motivate others to follow your lead? How do you deal with teammates that are resistant to change, really following up on that conflict management style? So change managers, you know, a lot of it boils down to we want to seek to understand candidates who can paint the overall vision and picture for an organization, that future desired state, and then really how do they break that down into manageable goals that they can achieve to really start developing that snowball effect of success as you're attempting that change in an organization. It's about building that clarity and alignment on that vision and strategy among teammates and individuals in an organization.
So that leads us, as we're getting towards the end of today's program, that leads us to an understanding that you have to pull all of this together. And you have to pull it all together in a way that compares candidates. Remember, we talked early on in both sessions 1 and 2 about structured interviews and about comparative candidate information. So just looking at the 18 characteristics, the competencies and the personal qualities, we end up with a radar graph that looks something like this. So here's our 4 fictitious employees, John, Craig, Heather, George, and Carol. And you can see with the different colors, you can see how they compare against one another. And if we're looking at Carol, then you see Carol's that purple line there. And you can see that in most cases, she's probably weaker than the others. So we developed this report that's called the Supplier Talent Acquisition Report, or STAR report, that profiles each candidate in an excruciating amount of detail. This is one of about 40 graphs that we use to explain how this candidate performs, as well as how they perform against the other final candidates, as well as how they perform against the population of candidates for that job position that we've interviewed from day one. So we actually compare candidates to candidates and candidates to benchmarks as well. So the final word going out of this program is that we need to use data in the interviewing process. That has been a comment that we've made throughout this program from the very first session. We need to leave all biases and intuitions at the door, let the facts speak for themselves. Or as I like to say, intuition or instinct on top of a foundation of facts can be very powerful. But intuition or instincts in today's world without the facts can be very dangerous. Remember, about 9 months to a year to discover a person isn't working out, 9 months to a year to replace them and get the other person up to speed. 2 years of lost momentum if you rely just on instincts. That idea that after 20 or 30-minute interview, you ought to be able to know all you need to know, you need to get rid of that. Anytime you read that, throw that book away, throw that article away. Don't listen to that individual. I can't understand how anybody thinks it's easier to understand a human being than it is to understand and learn your new iPhone or a new computer. The idea that we would spend less time trying to evaluate a person than we would be to select a new TV, to me, is just ludicrous. And so you have to leave the biases, you have to leave the instincts, leave the intuition at the door. You're not just comparing candidates against one another, but you're also comparing them against your competency model. In other words, your company's true needs. We also ask that you remember that candidates are also investing valuable time, so everything has to be done with a high level of dignity and a high level of feedback. The one thing that candidates have said about our process, there's two things they've said, is that it's thorough and you really do represent your candidates, your client's best interest. We see ourselves, when we're doing talent acquisition on behalf of our clients, we see ourselves as a direct link to between the candidate and the employer. We see that we are representing the culture and the dignity of that employer. And if you're doing this yourself, you need to understand that they're getting their opinions of the employer based on the way the interviews are done, both by internal as well as external individuals. And interviewing for any position is really a difficult and nerve-wracking experience, but you can never sacrifice quality and you can never sacrifice dignity in the process. You can never let your organization be known as an organization that damages a candidate's dignity. They can say the process was difficult, they can say the process was comprehensive, but if they say that, they'll usually say, wow, that's the kind of company I want to work for, one that takes talent acquisition seriously. And here's what candidates have said to us. They've said, our opinion is if a company takes recruiting seriously, we're pretty sure they'll take retention of employees seriously as well. So there's a direct link today in the talent acquisition world, in the talent's minds, between recruiting and retention. So Chris, why don't you tell us about part 4 that's coming up? And this will be the last slide, and then we'll wrap up with we have one question already submitted, by the way. If there's any other questions, please, now's the time to type them in and submit them.
Sure, and part 4 we're calling just closing the deal. It's really we want to dig a little deeper. These interviews that we've conducted, we've collected a lot of data on candidates. So we kind of gave you a preview of that report. We want to talk a little more how to use that data to develop those comparatives to really make those hiring and selection decisions. Once you have that data and once you talk with your colleagues, you're going to make an offer, hopefully make an offer to an individual, and then we're going to engage the best candidate, talk a little about how to hire and onboard that individual, and we want to share some ideas for post-hiring activities.
So with that, that wraps it up. So I have one question so far from Raphael, and I want to answer this one because it's a lengthy but very important question. So Raphael, and I'm going to paraphrase, indicates that in the prior programs we've talked about the number of hours. It could be 15 to 20, he says 22 hours. It's actually sometimes even more than that, with a candidate before they're even presented to our client. And so he says, don't you lose a lot of candidates in the process, and how do you keep from losing candidates with that amount of time spent with the candidates? Okay, that's a great question, Raphael. Brilliant question, because I get asked that all the time. I know Chris gets asked that all the time too. Here's the answer that we always give. It does take a lot of time. When we start the process, we send the candidate a flow chart of the process. We send them an explanation of the process. We send them a video that we've made of the process that they're going to go through. And we ask them before they engage in this process, we ask them to read and to watch those, that material. And we tell them it's because our client has engaged us, because our client is very serious about hiring in a very serious sort of way. And so we explain to them that process, and we say, look, if it's too much, let us know. But we also tell them that every step along the way, even if they don't go from gate 3 to gate 4, we will relate back and give them something of value to them. And I can say that in all the recruiting projects we've done, we've only ever had 2 individuals. Now, if you think about the average manager, director, VP, president sort of search is going to be between about 150 and 250 candidates in the pool. And if you've done numerous ones of those and only 2 individuals in total have ever said, I'm not going to go through that process, that's a pretty good hit rate. So yes, we're, the way you get them to understand the amount of time is that you make it very clear that they're going to spend this time, and you do it in advance. But also, secondarily, because we use video conferencing, it actually is faster for them. Interestingly enough, a person who spends 22 hours with us would have spent more than that just traveling in interviews, whether it's local or across the country. So you think about clients. We did a search for a plant manager in Indiana, and that would have required the top 4 candidates to probably all make, in the traditional recruiting model, 2, maybe 3, or even 4 trips. Believe me, that would be 100 hours that they would have spent in the process, although most of that would have been sitting on a plane, a train, or a bus, or in a car. And so at the end of the day, it's actually, most people understand it's not that much time. I reject the idea that says you ought to be able to interview somebody on the phone for 15 minutes and then meet with them for a half an hour, and make a decision. And if you can't get to the core of that individual in that period of time, then you're not a good interviewer. We need to stop thinking that is ridiculous. There's no possibility that can be done effectively and be repeatable. I know one individual in the talent recruiting business for a particular single company who is excellent with her instincts of really getting to the core capability of the people. And she'll still spend 4 or 5 hours total with an individual, but she also has very unique skills that most people in the recruiting and talent acquisition world don't have. So long answer to a short but important question. It all gets down to understanding a structured interview takes time to do, and you're not going to do it quickly. You can find ways to do it efficiently, and that's why we have the phase gate approach, because it gives us the ability to stop the interviewing process at any point in time and not put 30 candidates through 20 hours of recruiting when only 5 of them or 10 of them or something less than that need to go through it. So there's the answer to that question. And that's still the only question. Nobody in all that time that I was answering that, nobody submitted another question. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending. I see many of the same names from sessions 1 and 2. So a lot of you are sticking with this. We still have a 4th session next Tuesday. So on behalf of the Manufacturing Executive Institute and myself, Alan Dunn, the president of GDI Consulting and Training Company, and my colleague, Christopher Rios, the associate at GDI Consulting and Training, and really the brains behind the behavioral side of our talent acquisition. I'd like to thank you all. Bye-bye.